So we're good. And whenever the co-chairs are ready, we can begin.
Let's do it.
Ditto.
Well, today the agenda is really focused on the harvest strategy policy, but we wanted to spend some time going over the draft of the report this morning. And I really, am proud of all the MSAB members that stuck on yesterday. That was a pretty intense flurry of report writing yesterday. And we got a number of draft paragraphs, which I'm really excited about. A lot of good stuff coming out of this. And hopefully everybody was able to have a look at the draft report that was sent out last night. If you did not receive it, please let me know, but I sent it to the MSAB members, even those that were absent. And and so this morning, I think that I will just share my screen and we'll walk through this report, the one that I sent out last night, and have a discussion about that. I think my preference for today, is spend about an hour on this. Hopefully we can get through this in an hour, and get some really significant drafting done to where it's near finished. And then we'll talk about the draft harvest strategy policy, take up any other business like when should MSAB021 be. And then we can decide whether to take lunch or finish up the draft of the report, followed by lunch, and then have the adoption of the report at the end of the day. So we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, I guess. But I think the most important thing right now is to have a look at what we did last night, which was a lot of progress. So let me share my screen. And I'll just find it here. I think this is it.
Hey, Alan, I'm not sure. I just got a message from Kurt saying that he's been waiting in the waiting room for a bit.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. If the secretariat can have a look at that, that would be great. Sorry, shared the wrong thing, I think. Okay. Okay, I'm calling this one version 6. I sent out version 5 last night. This is exactly the same as 5 right now, and then it will just...
14 is where you want to be.
Hey, Kurt, you got him? I think. Sorry. Okay. All right. Okay, so this is the report, and we'll track some changes and be able to see what we did. Last night, we drafted some opening of the session, and that's just the boilerplate. We can walk through that specifically later. Regarding the membership, there was discussion about how they will be the members that are expiring. And I think the best thing for all the members that are present at this meeting, if there is anyone that is not willing to serve another term, please let us know. Otherwise, your silence will suggest you are willing. And I'm just going to run through the names of those that are set to expire. But there's Forrest at the end of the year, Chuck Ashcroft, which I believe is resigning from the MSAB, Peggy Parker is resigning at the end of the year. Carla Bush, Pete, you're you're expiring at the end of the year. Anne Marie, I imagine as a science advisor, you'll be very willing to serve another term. Scott, you're expiring. James, you're expiring. Pear and Robert Hockness, you're expiring as well. So for those present, if you're not willing, either just let me know or speak up during this meeting, and I'll reach out to those that were absent from this meeting and see what their take is, and then we can communicate with the commission on that. So we'll probably modify this with however many were present at the meeting and would be willing to serve. Okay. So then there's just all the outcome, and then we get into the meat of things. I think this morning I'll just give some general background so we can work through this, and then remember during in the later adoption of the report, we'll have the chance to really do some final wordsmithing on any of this. But so first is the MSAB was making a recommendation here in 13, paragraph 13, that the yield and variability and yield objectives be equal consideration during evaluation. I think that's useful and important. Anything in pink was something that the drafting committee suggested that they wanted to think about overnight and maybe come up with some more language. So feel free to stop me at any time. I'll try to monitor hands, but just jump in if I don't see you right away. And so this 14, 15, and 16 are all related to objectives. And so let's take a look at 14 first, because that's the objective on optimizing average coast-wide TCEY. And this is something that the SRB mentioned should be changed. So we had a discussion about this, and right now a potential paragraph is the MSAB's recommending the commission priority objectives optimize average coast-wide TCEY and limit annual changes in the coast-wide TCEY be combined to maximize the coast-wide TCEY subject to minimizing the annual changes in the coast-wide TCEY. So it's basically taking these two objectives and combining it into one objective that really highlights evaluating the trade-offs between it and giving them equal consideration. So maximize the coast-wide TCEY subject to minimizing the annual changes. It's a little bit more quantitative, and I think it will still allow the flexibility that the MSAB wants to determine during the evaluation what this really means. It's not too binding. Any thoughts on that?
I'd like to change the word minimizing the annual changes to limiting the annual changes.
Okay.
Yeah, Alan, this is Tom. I'm just curious to do that. I get the the TCEY, but what would they do with the AAV? Are they going to go for the lowest they can get, or are they going to anything below 15%, or how are they going to? How is that going to be treated?
So that is exactly the concern, Tom. The concern that the SRB had is they had that exact same question: is these objectives are not clear enough that it's obvious how they're going to be analyzed. And I think that the MSAB really wanted that flexibility to have a look at, are the first two objectives met? And if so, then what's the trade-off between these two? And actually not being bound to some specific method like a 15% AAV, which we really have a very difficult time meeting, but taking a look at the trade-off between the coast-wide TCEY and the variability in the TCEY, and determining where the best fit is. And that might often bring in other performance metrics and objectives, such as we've been talking about. So you're right, Tom, the SRB might have a little bit of, okay, you're moving in the right direction, but I'm not sure you're there yet. But I think we can see where we get to. And if the MSAB is okay with a more flexible way of evaluating these two concepts, then, I think this is a way to go forward. But this is the MSAB report, so we
Yeah,
want to make
thanks.
sure it reflects.
I see hands from Jim and Chris, but I'm not sure if Jim has microphone access yet. So maybe I'll jump
Oh,
to.
he's good.
Oh
He's
no,
good.
there he's good now. All right, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, so I guess I like that we moved off from these set AAVs of 15% or 10, and we're going to we're looking at the differences just on what really can be achieved. But I guess I'm also, or not guessing, I'm just kind of looking at, it would be nice to have, I don't know, when you say, oh, this one, the AAV is 23.2% and this one is 22.4. I mean, what's the real difference? I mean, in real terms, like how much real difference is there in these things? And I think if we're going, looking at, these two sort of dual objectives, that we should really see just how much difference in the grand scheme it's going to make. Like, does 23 really make much difference in the grand scheme over 21 or 22? That's the comment.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, Jim. And, if you're competing with 5 different management procedures and they differ on the median average TCY of 100,000 pounds, there's really no difference between any of them.
Yeah. And then, we may have yield differences that are real.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, I know this is, no, I'm not going to say it because I'll just go down this other road and just talk about.
I mean, the MSAB after this recommendation could have a note just mentioning that, the MSAB noted that other objectives and performance metrics are part of the evaluation, something like that as well. Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Hicks. What I'm wondering about is the wording in paragraph 14 and then in 15. But if we say maximize the coast-wide TCY subject to limiting the annual change in the coast, are we not giving more weight or more emphasis that it's on the limiting the annual change? You're saying you can only maximize the coast-wide catch TCY subject to. So you're actually creating a hierarchy there, aren't we?
It could be, yeah. We could change that wording. Or while considering the annual or something, yeah. Do you have any suggestion there, Chris?
I know we don't want to go with it. I just liked, I like the way you actually put it in the deck, where one was just maximize the coast-wide TCY, and the next one was I think it was minimize, or we could say limit the annual changes in the coast-wide TCY. I just actually like that as two separate things. I know if we combine them, maybe it's better, but I just think and we make it very clear that there's no hierarchy between those two. I just thought that's a more clear, given what we're trying to do, in that, as you pointed out, we're just looking at it and saying, okay, this is in this different management procedure results, here's the TCY and here's the annual change, and we can look at the trade-offs and say, okay, this one does a better job.
Yeah.
So would you just like to remove the word subject?
Well, I think what Chris is saying is more of a recommendation along these lines. Because the other objective is already limit the annual changes. So I think, Chris, what you're saying is just change that optimize average coast-wide TCY to maximize average coast-wide TCY.
Yeah.
And
yes.
it just has to be made really clear that these two objectives are to be given equal consideration, which I don't think that the commission's priority objectives put them in priority order with maximizing first. I mean, we might be getting into some, the weeds here and the semantics, but I think it's important.
Yeah, Dr. Hicks, this is Peggy.
Hi, Peggy.
Hey, I wasn't here for yesterday's, but I think
Oh, you just
in
cut
order
out.
to can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. We should say exactly what you said, which is, as we list these priority objectives, include in both, if they're separate, that they are given equal weight with each other, and just make that clear.
Yeah. Thanks, Peggy. Michelle, while I'm making a change, what do you have any recommendations or suggestions?
Yeah, good. And apologies for missing the discussion last night.
No
So
problem.
well, to that last point, I'm thinking, is there a way to assign them both the same priority number? So it's clear that one is not over the other. So anyway, think about that. Or I don't know if there's a way to make it clear that if you have like a 2 ABC, that A and B are equal weight, or anything that's under 2 has an equal weight, or something of that nature. But the reason that I raised my hand, and I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole necessarily, but what I've been struggling with is having the assessment period line up with the variation period, and going to like a triennial assessment, but still looking at the AAV. And I think Chris got to this question yesterday, just trying to better understand what happens in between assessment years. And is there a constant catch scenario that happens in between assessment years? Or does the TCEY still vary between assessment years? And I'm trying to think about how to make sure that the MSE outputs are more transparent. And if you have a triennial assessment, as an example, but your AAV still varies at 20% in between years, then you could have a situation of where in between assessments you have a variability of 50 to 60%, as an example. And so is there a way to make sure that those align and potentially limit the variability in between assessment years, so it's not an annual variability?
Yeah. So we had some discussion on that MSAB020, and was the reason that we presented these additional performance metrics with, max change, duration, that it's less than 15%. And another one is the probability that the AAV is greater than 15% in 3 or more years. And once we bring in, you're exactly right, Michelle, once we bring in this biennial and triennial assessments, there's a lot of things that would be good to evaluate and understand in more detail. And my apologies for not presenting that in more detail at this meeting. But yeah, and so yeah, I'm not sure how to go about that at this meeting. But I think maybe we can put that on hold for just a little bit until the end of this section That's more getting into the management procedures, unless it's related to this objective. But I see this objective just limiting variability and yield, encompassing all of that. And more in the evaluation process is when we would consider the, real specifics of it. Is there a big jump during an assessment year, and there's small jumps in between? What are the consequences of that? And there's different opinions on this. Is some people say the AAV is the AAV, and that's it. But other people are like, well, I'd rather have a higher average variability over 10 years and not one big jump in that 10-year period too. So there's some things to think about in terms of what limiting yield actually means. But I think for these three paragraphs, 13, 14, and 15 on the table right now are potential, and I think put potential paragraphs. So 13, my thought was that potentially you could combine all these concepts into one. And if you want to maintain two separate objectives for optimizing or maximizing average coast-wide TCY and limiting variability, that potentially you could put that into this one recommendation, the commission priority objective, optimize average coast-wide TCY, change to maximize, and yield and variability and yield objectives be given equal consideration. My thought on this is putting that into the one paragraph, I think, highlights the whole package rather than two separate recommendations that can sort of be disconnected. Just a thought there. We could combine them into the one objective as shown in 14, or keep it as two separate recommendations to keep the two yield and limiting variability and yield as separate objectives, and then prioritizing them as a second recommendation, or not prioritizing them. And the reason I bring this up, the current priority recommendations, the commission made a recommendation that the following are the priority recommendation or objectives in priority order. And so that's how it's stated. And then it goes A, B, C, and D. Sorry, Michelle, I don't mean to put that off for now, but I think we can have that discussion when we get down talking about the triennial management procedure, if that's okay.
Yeah, that works for me. Thank you.
Any thoughts on 13, 14, or 15? Any suggestions, preferences? And
Chris's hand is up. And also, before I go to you, Chris, Pete had to rejoin on his phone. His laptop was giving him issues. I see that he's in the meeting. But if the secretariat wouldn't mind giving him presenter status if they're able to, that would be helpful.
okay.
Chris, go ahead.
Okay, so for this change you made to 13, I think that might be a way to, providing we're agreeing on that, everyone's agreeing on this, but get our recommendation and make it very clear that there's no, between the two, there's no priority, that they are given the same priority. So does 13 basically now say that, well, we can knock off what is now 14, 15, and 15?
Yeah,
I think that's in my mind, what you've got there, maybe a little bit of wordsmithing. Let me just think about it. But I think it captures the discussion that we just seem to be having. And yeah, I would just say in yield objectives, and do you want to put in brackets beside it 2.2 and 2.3, or C and D to be more explicit? Just that would be my only thing. Just under there in yield objectives at the end of the line there, say in variability and yield objectives. I don't know if they call it 2.2, 2.3, or C and D.
Yeah,
whichever.
we can highlight exactly what we're talking about here. We can maybe even bring in a note of the commission's priority objectives before that to make it clear. But I think for now, in the interest of time, given we've worked on one paragraph in half an hour, maybe we try to get agreement whether 13 is okay, and then we do some wordsmithing during the adoption if necessary.
Okay,
People can have a think about it. Does that work?
works for me.
So is anybody opposed to 13, paragraph 13? Or, you know, some major wording of it? And we'll just bring in more specifics of what the objectives, the two objectives are in relation to the commission objectives.
I'm fine with kind of moving on and wordsmithing later.
So maybe we'll put so actually we'll do a recall and then we can just quote it. From the report where they adopted them. And then that'll have A, B, C, and D, and then we can just refer back to it. Something like that. Okay, so these two paragraphs are then going to be deleted. And that's a recommendation from the MSAB. We'll have a chance to go over this again before the end of the day. 15. So this is something that, well, again, in pink, wanted to think about overnight, that a new objective to maintain the coastwide TCY above X and at least X% of the time may be useful because it is meaningful to stakeholders, may define a minimum coastwide TC necessary for economic viability. It may be a proxy for maintaining catch rates and absolute spawning biomass above a threshold, which may be important to stakeholders. A lot of mays in there. And I think we can just delete this. This is pretty general. Any thoughts on that? We could delete it.
More so kind of structuring. I'm wondering if it might make sense to swap 15 and 16. 16 says that a new objective may be defined using XYZ absolute biomass, commercial catch rates, or coastwide TCY. Then goes into some of the cons of using various options, and then 15 says kind of hones in on the coastwide TCY option. So I wonder if if it makes more sense and is more readable with them swapped.
Yeah, no, I do like that, Gwen.
I think what you've got there, Alan, 15 and 16 now, I think that is an accurate reflection of the discussions that we had.
Mm-hmm.
They are, we noted, we haven't made a decision on it, but those were the discussions that we did have. So I think that is, in my recollection, that reflects what we talked about.
Okay, and 15, I think, is coming from the ad hoc meeting. Okay, well, we'll keep those in and we'll move on. 17 is another note. The RSB 36% objective, which will be B up above, and is a useful objective because it separates fishing effects from environmental effects on the stock, scales with changes in productivity, defines a desired relative spawning biomass to be at or above, is based on a proxy for BMEY, and is an objective that is often important to certification agencies. I think that's another good reflection of the discussion that was had as well. Any thoughts on that one? 18 is the BMEY proxy is based on 1.2 times BMSY, but a multiplier of 1.45 has been used for data poor fisheries. Therefore, a suitable proxy for BMEY may be between B36 and B43%. Another point brought up during the meeting.
But this is not a data poor species.
Yeah, I know. I think that's useful, but a multiplier has been used for data poor species. That's why we have used that's why we did use the B36%.
So I think maybe we should, land on, but what is it we think is appropriate based on this is a data rich? It's 36 or is it 40 or so? I think, do we say that now or later?
Well, I think again, in my mind, 18, we're saying what was discussed, and I'm the guilty party for bringing it up. And I actually said 1.2 to 1.4, but because I forgot. But Alan's correct here to say it's actually 1.45, and added the point in that I think is actually useful to know. It is for data poor fisheries, which we're not a data poor fishery. So again, I think it's what we've got there is factual.
I'm just going
to. I'm just saying, do we want to, or just goes down to the inner part of this report writing? Got to get my mind back to it. It comes later down.
Jim, does that get at it? Because I see Jim's point. I think that was Jim. That we have settled on a B36% proxy for BMAY because that's probably the most supported given the core species. So now this does continue to support the B36, but highlights that it may not be B36.
Yeah, we talk about it below, right?
I don't think so.
20 or 21.
Yeah, we don't talk about BMEY really.
No, but the
no. Actually, there's a recommendation to move it to be 40%.
Yeah.
So that.
It doesn't. I don't think it. I mean, you said you're just saying. It can go from 1.2 to 1.45 depending on data richness of the data richness, or however you want to work it, and then we're making a recommendation below. Okay.
All right. Well, let's. Maybe this does need to be in a different order then.
No, but I think it sets it up right. It's saying we're 336 BSMY 1.2 BSMY, but there is a range in that estimate that covers between 36 to 43 or whatever.
Right.
Depending on data richness for the species. So then when we talk about it in 20 to 21 or 22,
yeah,
when we're proposing to 40, we've already set up that that's kind of in the range of what we for that metric.
Yeah, I think what was 19 could be moved, but if we have what is now 18, and we can modify this back, what is now 19, and that refers to this, sets up 20. So I guess the question is, let me, I'm going to put this back to how it was. Sometimes the review. So I guess while I'm doing this is have a look at paragraph 20. And I'm curious on the MSAB's thoughts on that as a recommendation.
Chris, I think you were the one that brought this up. Do you want to run through the rationale again? I mean, it's sort of here, the rationale's there, but in my mind, it seems to me, and maybe this spans a couple meetings, that the whole discussion about whether B36 was a target or a threshold, and it's somewhere in my mind, I thought that maybe you were saying if you have B40 as a target, then it sort of makes B36 a threshold and kind of keeps it up in a little bit higher area.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Forrest. Yeah, I'll just give I think we do all have to think this through very carefully because could be some big implications of making this change.
Yep.
Right now, the B36 it started out as a target and now it's been treated as a threshold that we want to be above at least 50% of the time, which I'm fine with. Because it still kind of can serve as a target. People look at it and some will say, yeah, it's kind of a target, because of the 50%. What I think we have to think about here carefully is right now, as it's noted above, if you have a fishing intensity of 39, you're gonna get your B36. We're at a fishing intensity of 43 is the reference. That gets us to 38.8 or something like that. Okay, so it gets us around to 39, B39 over the long term. So what I think we have to think, there's two sort of parts to it here is what do we want the upper stock reference, or sorry, the threshold to be? I think, if we leave it as a threshold, I'm fine with that. If we change it from B36, and I'll give you an example. Here's one thing that does concern me about maybe, necessarily going to B40, but we had just a few years back, we were at B33, as everyone remembers, right? Or B33. And then there was a change to the age, the natural mortality in so it changed to one variable, one parameter in one of the four ensemble models. And that took us, that single change took us from B33 to B42. So my concern, maybe I think something we all need to think about here is if we all of a sudden went to a B36 is a good number. Don't get me wrong, it's a good number. If I like B40, but if B36 as we want to be above it 50% of the time, still means we can be at B40. We just need to be above B36. If all of a sudden there was another change in a parameter of the model, it can change that relative spawning biomass stock status significantly. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying we've seen it happen. And what I don't think we want to do is create an objective that we can't meet, or it becomes very difficult to meet, and would require significant changes. So that's the only thing I think we all need to think about. I know when we were thinking about this yesterday and writing out the report yesterday, everyone thought we needed to think about it a little bit more. So I just think we all have to understand the potential implications of moving from B36 to a B40. And tied into that, of course, is what's your fishing intensity, because the fishing intensity of our current fishing intensity of B43 puts us at, and over the long term, B38.8. So that's the only thing I just want people to think about is we can still have a SPR of say 46 if that's what we decide, and that will put us around B41.5, I think Dr. Hicks said. And it puts us above that reference point, that threshold reference point. So I just think we have to be careful of the just make sure we're not putting ourselves in a situation where all of a sudden we're looking a year or two down the road or 3 years and going, oh man, what have we done, right? So yeah. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I just think one of the things with setting objectives is we want to make sure that they're objectives we can achieve. And do we think that changing this to B40 is too aggressive? I just think
I think that's a good point, Chris, because another potential consequence is, if you are going through a certification process, they'll be looking through these different objectives and they'll just pin themselves on 36% or 40%, whatever's in the objective. So they may interpret that as a target. They may interpret that as something you don't want to go below. It's a number for them to focus in on. And so you really want it to be a number or a value or a threshold or a reference point that you truly believe in. I think in terms of the scientific opinion of this and what would go into the harvest strategy policy, we would maintain the B36% as the BMEY right now. That is the most defensible in terms of the analyses that have been done. And B40% would, be this sort of just a threshold that is more precautionary than the B36%. But I don't think the science could just suddenly switch and then say, oh yeah, no, we'll take B40% as the BMEY. We don't know what BMEY is. I think it's a defendable proxy for BMEY. Either of these points, it's within the uncertainty range. We're using it as a proxy, but as a reference point in the harvest strategy policy, which you'll see later, we'd probably maintain B36% as BMEY as a proxy, the real proxy for BMEY. But that doesn't mean the objective can be B40%.
Yeah, we could do that, and I take your point. It's more precautionary, but the thing is, then B42 is more precautionary. Like, I just think, and I don't know if I explained this well to everybody, but I think we all just have to think a little bit about this in terms of the point that Dr. Hicks just made for things like eco certification labels. They're going to look at those numbers, whether it's B36 or B40, and where we are with respect to those, and we want to make sure we've got something that is defensible, is realistic, and makes sense for where we want the stock to be at least. And the point Dr. Hicks just made about looking at it, B36 is probably going to be BMEY, is what's more likely for this stock, BMEY. I think that's what I just heard. So I don't know if people want to think about this for a little bit, because this is a recommendation. If it gets updated, there may be no consequences. I might be overthinking this thing, but I think I want to make sure everyone has thought this through as we decide what to do here for a recommendation. I mean,
yeah. Thanks, Chris. And I think there's 3 paths forward right now. Noting paragraph 22 as well. There's really, I think it's either paragraph 20 or paragraph 22 or neither of these. And so I think that's the way forward. What I'm going to do, I think this paragraph really belongs at the end of this, and we can decide that later. But I want to sort of get it out of the way so that we can see paragraphs, what's now 20 and 21, both in pink. I don't think we can have both of those as recommendations. They're sort of contradictory to each other. This one is updating the objective, maintain the long-term coastwide above a threshold to have a B40. This one is replacing that objective with a new objective of remaining above, say, the spawning biomass in 2023 or something like that.
Sorry, Doctor, could I just add one other thing?
Yeah.
I just, like I said yesterday to everybody, as I said yesterday, I like SPR 46. The more I sort of look at it, the more I play with the MSE tool. My personal view is I like SPR 46. And that leads to a different, what you would achieve over the long term in terms of a target or whatever. It puts you around, like Dr. Hicks said yesterday, B41.5. And that's sort of what led me to the B40. But I just think that everyone needs to think about this and say, are we, by having it B36 at least 50% of the time, we're not saying we can't be at B40. We're just saying we want to be above B36. And I just want to make sure everyone, as we're considering this, understands that I don't want to call it a risk, but I'll call it a risk that just, if we get a change in a parameter or something happens, we don't want to be in a situation where we've got an objective that we can't meet.
It would be helpful for me to understand what we're trying to address with this. Like, are we trying to address not getting too close to the ramp very often? Are we trying to address leaving an absolute spawning biomass that we're comfortable with, like, or that we're targeting some stability and higher TC-wise? Like, what are we, from a stakeholder's standpoint, which they only care about the benefits, not the science? What are we trying to address with this?
I think that's a good question for us, and maybe I'll take a stab at it from how I see it, and then maybe others can pipe in. But I look at this as kind of a where do we want to be, and I know it's like you say, it's tangled in. It's maybe not as meaningful to all stakeholders, and as they focus on things like, well, what's the TCUI? But this is kind of where do we want the stock to be, and it's how do we stay away from the ramp? How do we stay away from B30? And that's one of the reasons I like SPR 46, F46, sorry, more as efficient intensity. But in my mind, I look at this is a kind of a where do we want to be with the biomass, its stock status over the long term.
And where this this is really coming from is, the decisions the commission has been making recently and made, us think about, well, is this the proper objective? Maintain the long-term coastwide spawning biomass above B36%. Is that the right objective, given that we're really harvesting at a much lower fishing intensity? And so the question here is there a different objective? Like, we really just want to keep the spawning biomass above this absolute level such that catch rates are decent and there's enough fish to go around, or are we talking about we just want to keep this relative spawning biomass above a different value than B36%? So from my point of view, non-stakeholder, but more of a scientist, it's like, well, what is the objective of the commission if they're not following the management procedure, the reference management procedure, when spawning biomass does get low? So 21 is, there's some hands up. So Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I want to say first that I agree with Chris's general points of liking the SPR at 46 and having a target of B40. And I'm not entirely sure how precise the model results are, and I'm just focused on number 20. And I was initially thinking, what if we revise that to be a female spawning stock biomass that's above a reference point and get rid of the at or, and just to make sure that it's always above, or it's above that reference point at least 50% or more of the time. And so it's not at that reference point within that 50%. And then I started wondering just about how precise we should be given just the uncertainty in the results. And is that something that we want to refine, of where maybe it's above a reference point of B38% at least 50% or more of the time? So just trying to dial that in a little bit more, throw that out for thought.
Just going to try to write that out real quick. And are you suggesting B38?
Well, I guess that's more of a question for you, Alan, of just, is that is that going to make a significant difference? Or is that a wash?
It's not going to make, I don't even think, I mean, B40% makes a little bit of a difference. But I think the defense of an SPR 46%, if the MSAB likes that, that comes more from the analysis of yield and variability in yield than this. You know, going to B40% takes 30% or 43% off the table because it wouldn't meet this objective anymore. And I think that's what Chris was saying. You might have to be careful because now you are you're in a new space where you're limited a little bit more. So it does support the 46%, but as Chris said, if a new analysis, I update the operating model, do a bunch of new simulations, and F46% results in a long-term spawning biomass of 39.5, then then it doesn't meet B40% anymore. And so, and then there's the concept that, you know, I'm not comfortable changing the reference point for BMEY to another value just based on, you know, I think we have BMEY sort of settled in based on the analyses done in 2019. So yeah, I think actually, in my honest opinion, I think at or above I get the at or above, and then I get the 38%, but to be honest, it's not going to make any difference to the evaluations. But it could be useful as, you know, really clarifying the objective. And I do like the above a biomass without the at, because it really specifies it's not a target. You want to be above that value. So I do like that part of it.
But if you're above BMEY or B36, I mean, that puts that if that's your base and you're avoiding that, that's almost like 100% of the time. So that's going to put your B number up higher, quite a bit higher, right? If we're above or below 50% of the time, but we want to be above B36, then if you called out a target for just a fishery objective, then you'd have to call it B40, or am I missing the point?
Well, I think this objective would still be above B36% at least 50% or more of the time. So you can go below it.
Okay.
And yeah, so I think it still would be a fishery objective in that sense. You know, maintaining the biomass above any reference point 100% of the time is all you can really do is B0, B0%, not B0, but B0%. You can maintain, well, I don't know, the stock could go extinct, so you really can't say that either.
Okay, well, I guess I was misunderstanding the use of above, and maybe I didn't hear the 50% point. But one thing that is there not some incongruity saying that we support SPR 46 and then have a separate, which leads to a long-term B41? I guess they're
compatible.
inseparable, are they not?
They are compatible, because so even let's say an F43% would be compatible with 36%. This objective being 36% here, and so if this objective is maintain the long-term coastwide female spawning biomass above a biomass reference point of B36% at least 50% or more of the time, F43 would still meet that objective. And then you'd say, okay, F43 meets that objective, F46 meets that objective. Now let's move on to yield and variability in yield and analyze these two. And you're like, wow, actually F46 reduces the AAV compared to F43. Therefore, there's some more support for F46, even though you lose a little bit of yield. And that's the trade-off that you have to then analyze.
Okay, so this is more like our sideboard. The other is when we call it our SPR number, we're maybe talking about preference of where we want the stock to be.
Yeah. So what this objective, being above the reference point at least 50% or more of the time, is doing is that it actually limits. It says you can only consider F40 or higher fishing intensities. So you cannot go to F39%. That does not meet this objective. F38% does not meet this objective. But an F40 barely meets this objective. It's like, it's above 51% of the time or something like that. And so it limits that space. And now you're working with, well, I can harvest at an F40 or less. And that's now the management procedures we're looking at.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for being patient, as this is still a learning process and probably always will be.
Yeah, it is for me too. So I guess, so I guess now we have 3 on the table. In the interest of time, that I'm wondering if maybe we just leave these 3 for now and people can have a think about it throughout the day. And I'm just gonna do this. And oops, that was wrong. So there's basically 3 related to this objective, 3 possible recommendations or none. And one of them is to just replace the 36% with a B40%. The second one is to remove the at or and maybe replace the B36% with something else. And then the third one is to completely replace the objective with a brand new objective, maintaining it at or above a biomass reference, or maintain it at or above some absolute spawning biomass, or even a TCY, which that one disappeared, didn't it? Yeah. So let's have a think about this. If it's okay, we can move on and make sure that we get to the harvest strategy policy today, because there isn't a whole lot to add to the report, I don't think, on that, but it's a very important couple of paragraphs to add. Any objection to that? We'll leave these in place for now. This last paragraph, which I kept moving down and down, is more related to this last objective. And so if this gets removed, we'll have to think about if this paragraph stays. But it was a statement, I think it's a very useful statement, noting that an objective can be met by actually putting in an element to the MP, such as a control rule, which is the same concept as, we did with putting in a constraint. Okay, so let's move on, because this is going to take some time too to talk about. And this is the actual management procedures. And Michelle, remind me, this is where we'll talk about the triennial and the behavior of AAV within a multi-year assessment approach. So some notes that all the MPs evaluated met the conservation objective. They all met this threshold biomass objective being above B36%. And that a fishing intensity higher than SPR 40% would be required to not meet this objective. The TCY was reduced by approximately 1.3 million pounds with every 1% increase in the SPR. The high average annual variabilities, mostly due to 3 types of uncertainty: assessment, observation, and decision making. This is an important note here in 29 now. The MSAB noted that AAV and variability in the coastwide TCY increased at a greater rate for SPR values less than 46% and was similar at SPR values of 46% or greater. This is that little kink in the curve. All of a sudden, to 43%, it went up greatly. And then this is one that was to be thought about. And the plot here is for reference right now, just because that's what it's referring to. And so that lower fishing intensities, higher SPR values, reduced the medium coastwide TCY and resulted in higher absolute spawning biomass. So that's a real result that is easy to see. There's a greater than 1 in 3 chance that the short-term absolute spawning biomass will be less than 2023 spawning biomass when fishing a reference SPR 43%, That chance was approximately 1 in 4 for long-term spawning biomass. So fishing at FV 43%, there's still a chance that in 4 to 14 years, the spawning biomass will be less than 2023. Fishing at an SPR equals 52% reduced these chances to approximately 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 for the short and long terms. So there's less chance of the spawning biomass going below what it was in 2023 if we reduce fishing intensity. However, there's benefits to the biomass, in other words, what it's saying. But however, lower fishing intensities did not realize high TCYs seen at higher fishing intensities. And that's this plot. So the low fishing intensity here, you see the top of the plot is just above 80, whereas the higher fishing intensities, the higher realizations of TCYs in the 80s to 100s, and did result in lower TCYs more often than seen at higher fishing intensities over the short term. And that's the bottom of this plot. You see more often, you see low TCYs than when you're fishing at a higher fishing intensity here. And this is the 25th percentile, the little darker line there. Okay, any thoughts on that paragraph? It has a lot in it, but I think it's actually a really, really important result of trying to put a lot of these things together and these trade-offs together.
Chris's hand is up. Go
Okay.
ahead, Chris.
And I think paragraph 30 is basically just reflecting what we saw with the analysis. So it's factually correct. My only question, concern, if you will, is that I think somebody reading it would say, okay, do we need to provide some rationale as to why these high TCYs did not result, the lower fishing intensities did not result in the higher TCYs? Like, why did that happen? Because it's counterintuitive to what somebody would think. So is there, why this is happening? Because, in my mind, I'd be like, hold it, we're lower fishing intensities, we don't get a higher TCYs. Because I think it showed that over the short term and the long term. I know that this is just over the short term, but I was surprised when it was short term and long term. And so I just think I think that's a question that falls out of this. Is there an easy way to explain why this is the case?
We saw the plot for long term as well, which is not commonly reported. It's not part of the priority objectives. It's actually not part of the objectives at all, the long term TCY, but it is something that I always find useful to look at. We did look at that plot and it showed a very similar pattern. So I don't think it was any different in the long term. And I mean, it might take a little bit more digging to really understand why this is, but I think the key is that fishing at a lower fishing intensity is just always reducing the TCY. It's not resulting in a buildup of biomass that results in a higher TCY in the long term. That will be hard to explain. I totally get your point though, Chris. It's like, okay, great, thanks, all those facts. Now, what does that really mean?
Yeah, it's just like, even as I read it now, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's what we saw.
Mm-hmm.
But wow, if I had to explain that to somebody and said, well, why did that happen? I'd be like, well, I don't really know. We looked at it over the long term, and like you said, this is a short-term objective. But even when we looked at it over the long term, it kind of showed the same thing. Well, then why are we worried about fishing intensity?
Could I offer something, Alan?
Yep.
Yeah, I completely support what Chris's point is here too, because I have the same perspective, but because the cause, the why, is undetermined, and in the interest of moving forward, could we put that statement there, that this, or something to that effect, that the interaction of these particular procedures needs more examination to understand the complete interplay between the parameters, or so, something like that, something to that effect. The why to sort of bookmark this is we don't completely understand why, but it's of interest to the MSAB, and probably will be to other people who read this report down the line, including the commissioners. Doesn't sound like we can come up with an easy explanation sitting here today, even though I completely agree it's warranted. I'm very curious as well.
So maybe it's an MSAB request. MSAB requested more exploration into understanding the patterns
Yeah, there you go.
presented in paragraph 30. And being a request, that means I'll have to do it. I don't have to do it, but I'll do it.
I hope you're curious too, because
I am very curious.
Yeah, then that would be great. We would request this, if everybody's okay with that.
I'm good with that.
Boy, this is, I'm going to get busy with the annual meeting, and then right after February 1st, I'm going to say, okay, what did the MSAB want me to do this year? And I'll be, holy cow, what was this? I'm going to have to remember this one. Okay.
Hey, Alan, can I just throw this out? Like at the very beginning of the paragraph 30, where we say lower fishing intensities reduce the median coastwide TCY and result in higher absolute spawning biomass. So we're talking about a trade-off in that sentence, correct? I mean, that's what comes, like, there's a benefit, but there's also a drawback. The benefit is we maintain a higher absolute spawning biomass, but the drawback is that it reduces median coastwide TCY using a F52. Could we swap those around and say MSAB noted that that using higher SPR values, or whichever way we're saying it, resulted in higher absolute spawning biomass, but reduced the median coastwide TCY. So we're pulling out, the pros and cons of it, and then, or am I missing the point? Maybe.
No, I think it can be worded with however the MSAB would like it to be worded. I think the way it's worded now just presents it as a trade-off. Putting it in resulted in higher absolute spawning biomass, but resulted in a lower TCY might have a little bit of different connotation to it, in that, it's saying there's this good thing, but there's bad things, So I think it's at the preference of the MSAB, however they would like it to be worded.
Well, it seems like we're always speaking to objective, like fishery objectives in this sense, the trade-off. So, I mean, this is put out without any, sense of preference, but it seems like there is preference within our discussion. Like, we want higher TCYs, but we also want, higher absolute spawning biomass, but we recognize that through this analysis that there was a trade-off. So you get one, but you're sacrificing the other. But that's may just be only my take on it. So I'm not pushing for that necessarily.
So is this what you were thinking, Forrest?
Yeah, I mean, to me that aligns with the message here. But
Okay.
again, I don't want to speak for the whole MSAB on this.
No, I think we all have an individual voice, and then it comes together as one. So any objection to this change? Okay, any objection to this MSAB request? Okay, I don't see any hands. We'll move on, and we'll delete this figure from this document as well. do that now. So remember, okay, so now we're talking about the triennial in paragraph 32 here. The median TCY was slightly greater and interannual variability was less with the triennial assessment frequency for SPR values between 40 and 52%. So that was a result. A constraint on the coastwide TCY reduces the interannual variability and also reduces the median coastwide TCY. Let me back up for 1 second and bring up Michelle's comment here. And maybe, Michelle, I'm wondering if, to get at your point that you had earlier, I'm going to try to write something to try to get your point. All right, you can see I'm thinking on the fly. We did try to take a look at this, and let me know if I'm getting close, Michelle, but we did try to look at this on slide 23 with all these different performance metrics. And we did see that with the triennial, the maximum change was higher than with an annual assessment. So there was a potential for the maximum change in any 1 year could be higher, but the duration of years with a lower than 15% annual change was also greater. So it tended to have a lower average annual variability, more time where it was less than 15% average annual variability, but there was a chance that every once in a while it could have a larger jump than with an annual assessment frequency. So am I getting close here, Michelle?
Yeah, thanks. I like the way that you had explained it earlier about the trade-off of having, multiple smaller annual changes versus occasional larger changes in between assessments. And so I think we're on the same page of what we're trying to say. It's just trying to capture it there. And then I guess the other part of my point was that in the MSC, should we be looking at something that allows us to be able to easily detect when this happens, so that we're not just looking at AAV, but is there a way that we could actually have it look at changes that match up with the assessment frequency? So, a triennial change.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about that at MSAB020, and but I mean, I tried to come up with some really good metrics on that, and I just couldn't. And that's where these metrics came up with. And because the problem was when we have the biennial in there, you have a biennial and then a triennial, trying to match up those years where there's an assessment is really difficult. And that's why we went to a 15-year period. Maybe it would smooth it out a little bit more. But if we're just comparing an annual and a triennial, it may be possible. I'm bringing up I want to look at the MSAB report from 19, because I think there was a statement for the Secretariat to continue working on this, and maybe we can just sort of recycle that. Okay, so let me see. All right, I might have to do this at a break or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's paragraph 47 in that MSAB 19 report. Yeah, so there's, you know, I'm going to share this really quick. I'll just copy it in here so that I don't have to reshare my screen. You can see what came out of MSAB 19. Oh, that's ugly. So here's a number of paragraphs from the MSAB 19 report, noting that various performance metrics were presented, and that a performance metric indicating the duration of stability may be useful, and that calculating performance metrics over a 15-year period may allow for more accurate comparison, and then they're requested to report these new performance metrics. So yeah, I think it's just a little bit more work. I wasn't as impressed with these performance metrics as I thought I might be. Okay, so that's the little bit of background. And where are we? We're right here. So is there some way you would like, is there a request coming out of this, or the Secretariat continue to work on performance metrics that might indicate that might provide more insight into the interannual variability when with a triennial assessment frequency or something like that?
Thanks, Alan. I would like to hear from others. I don't know if this is just me, but I'm just trying to think of a way that it would be helpful if the results could more clearly flag, right? Because right now you kind of have to interpret it's still reported as AAV, and you can see that the AAV is higher, but you don't necessarily know what then the end result is at the end of the assessment period.
Yeah. How does the MSAB feel about these two new paragraphs here? (33) and 34.
Dr. Hicks, it's Chris Spohr.
Yeah.
Okay, so paragraph 33, second sentence. It is possible that smaller changes occur between assessments. Should that be an S?
Yeah.
And then could we say and occasional changes larger than with an annual assessment frequency occur in, could we just make it clear and say triennial assessment years?
Yeah.
Okay. And with respect to paragraph 34, we do have some metrics there, right? We have the AAV, it shows what happens.
The annual change, the AC, and that's like, you know, it's greater than 15% in 3 or more years, and some others like that.
So what could we, beyond I guess I'm trying to figure out, beyond the numbers we could actually pull or that you've got in your presentation, what other performance metrics could we look at? Because we can look at those over short term, which is up to 14 years. And then you can do them over the longer term or the medium term.
I was thinking more on the lines of maybe, and you know, we thought about this a little bit before the last MSAB meeting, but maybe something like, what is the change in only assessment years? And what is the change in non-assessment years? You know, what is the AAV in non-assessment years? What's the AAV in assessment years? Or lining up the years to match. You'd have to line up the years to match because of the population, what's happening with the population. It gets complicated. And that's why some people I've talked to, including scientists, I've talked to about this problem. And they're like, yeah, but that is interesting. You know, what is the bigger change? But really the underlying concept is, what is the average variability over time? But I'm like, yeah, but some people don't want to have that big change after 3 years, you know, after 2 or 3 years. So it's really, and there's a way I presented it before. What is more important? The average variability, say over a 10 to 20 year period. And sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's a little. Or is it more important to have periods of stability, or can you accept having periods of stability with an occasional larger change? And that's sort of an objective, you know. That's not science. Science can do, you know, could do either. So it's really an objective of the fishery.
Yeah, I guess I'm not opposed to more research. I guess I'm just struggling with what those performance metrics would be. And I just think you can end up going down a pretty deep rabbit hole trying to answer this one. So I was hoping if we could narrow it down a bit, but it sounds like it requires a lot of thought, because I think the thing is, what we've got, like you say, you've got what happens between when in non-assessment years versus what happens between assessment years. They're kind of two. And then what happens on an annual basis over a certain time period. Because I just think that, if you have, like we just saw, like for instance, and I know the decision making is at the commission level, but we have an assessment, say last year using this was an assessment year, and this year now we've got the FIS results, which coastwide are showing a decline of 9% according to what's up on the internet. Does that mean that we're reducing the TCUI by 9%? That's I think we're not, and I guess this comes later in the discussion as we talk about what sort of assessment frequency we want. But I just think there's still a few unknowns there. That's all.
Yeah, and to be honest, this is the third time this has really come up. I remember when we first started investigating the biennial, I presented a figure showing the actual changes in the TCUI over time. And then it came up at MSAB019. And I feel like this is something that the Secretariat should investigate or do more research on, because it seems to be, there's all this indication that moving to a triennial or biennial even assessment frequency has a lot of benefits. And now we're seeing it increases yield, it reduces the AAV, but there's still a little bit of a hang up on it. There's still some concerns on it. And I think we need to make sure that we have the performance metrics so people can evaluate it fully.
But, and I don't, sorry, it's Jim, I don't disagree. But I'm just sort of thinking, to me, my mind goes to, well, let's just try it out for a period of time, say for one cycle, and let's just see how it works.
Yep.
To me, okay, we've talked about this now for it seems like a really long time. Maybe it's just in MSAB, it's maybe about a year or two, but that version of this was, Dr. Clark in here, 98, which the conditional constant catch, which went over, as Bruce Lehman said, like a lead balloon, the way it was at that time. but this is kind of a more refined kind of process. I think, you know, I think we should recommend once that we should try this out for a cycle, whether it's biannual or triennial, and sort of look at, okay, how does it actually work? And knowing that we do have our distribution process includes the decisions of the commissioners that can, you know, which tends to smooth things out as they have for the last 100 years.
No, I think that's a really good point, Jim. It has been tested with the MSE. It shows benefits. There's probably some little nuances that we're not, you know, that we would learn by implementing it, but that's part of the MSE process as well. If you remember the little graph with the 4 boxes, the arrow for after application goes back into the MSE process again.
Yeah.
So yeah, and also a reminder, it's in non-assessment years, the reference TCY is not remaining fixed. It's actually changing with how the survey changes. So it is tracking a little bit, and the survey is, you know, has a good correlation with the stock assessment as well. Okay, so is the MSAB good on these 2 new paragraphs, 33 and 34?
I see Michael's hand up.
Oh, yeah.
Michael, go ahead.
I was just wondering, Alan, could you report a new metric that was, say, TAA? So that's the triannual assessment variability. So this is what we're doing annually. This is what's going to happen triannually if we go to the triannual system, and then we could compare those results and make those trade-offs. Whereas right now with the annual variability, we're going to see it every year. There may be some larger ones that come in because there's a big change in the assessment, but we see that every year. If we saw what happened if we went to the triennial system with a 10% limiter or whatever the FIS set indicates, then we probably won't see a lot if we're using the FIS in non-assessment years. But then people could make this comparison directly. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Michael. And I think I would call it ATV, average triennial variability, something like that. So yeah, I'll give that some thought. Wrote that in my notes.
We have Forrest's hand up.
So we're talking about triennial assessment, but we are talking that the FIS would sort of drive TC-wise in the interim, right, in between. But where in this discussion does it come in? Like, I think there's some concern about the different options for the FIS, like not surveying some of the fringe, like area 4 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like excluding that how would that fit into this? Because I think there's some real reluctance to support this if, you know, area 4B is going to find out that when they finally get surveyed, if it ends up being like on a 2 or 3 year cycle, that there's going to be like magnificent changes for them. That's just for example.
Yep. No, I think that's a really good point, is that moving to a triennial, that was not, so the triennial frequency was examined with the base block design, so assuming it's unbiased, but we did FIS design analyses, but only with the annual assessment. We did not do it with the triennial. And so what would happen is the uncertainty would increase and the bias increases. And so you would expect the AAV to increase and the FIS to not track the biomass as well, and thus not, you know, be more uncertain in its estimate of the reference TCY. But those are not done, and it might be useful to put in a statement down below in one of these paragraphs to getting at that idea. I'm just gonna put a marker right there.
I think that's a really good idea, Dr. Hicks, to explain basically just what you just said, to make sure we're, everyone's aware of it.
While I'm typing this in, have a look at 35, 36, and 37. There's a comment on 37. What that is. Oh, what the? Uh-oh. My computer is thinking really hard right now. Something's going on. Uh-oh. Am I still coming through?
I can hear you. I can see you.
Okay. Yeah.
we can
For
still
some
hear and see
reason,
you.
Word is frozen on me here.
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah. So Word is frozen on me. I'm going to just stop sharing it for a second. Maybe that's why. Yeah. Shoot.
The joys of technology.
Yeah, actually. Yeah, it doesn't want to stop sharing.
We can't see it anymore.
Yeah, now it's sort of affecting my Adobe as well. I'm gonna log off on this Adobe.
Folks, I just noticed in the agenda, we are scheduled to have a break at 10:45. Wondering if it might be useful to kind of take that break now. And hopefully when we come back, Dr. Hicks will be back up and running. What do folks think?
That sounds good to me.
All right. So also put it in the chat as well. I'm just looking at my schedule. So we are scheduled to have a 15-minute break. It is 10:40. Why don't we plan to come back at 10:55?
Sounds good. Looks like Dr. Hicks is also typing something in the chat.
Okay, he's asked that we take a look at the report. We're behind schedule. So maybe let's take a bit of a break, have a bit of a bio break, but then also hopefully when Dr. Hicks is able to get joined again, we can continue.
Thanks, Gwen.
Thanks, folks. Alan, while we were on break and you were getting your tech stuff sorted out, I put some notes in the chat, some of my comments for the rest of the paragraphs that we need to go through. Don't know if that will help kind of expedite the process, noting that we are behind schedule. So kind of up to you how you'd like to proceed with this. I do think kind of hashing out the report is important, and there have been really good conversations, but also recognizing that we need to review the harvest strategy policy as well.
Yeah, and I think I was looking at the schedule. We actually have a drafting schedule or drafting session scheduled from 1 to 2:30 this afternoon. And I think the time we're spending here is really time that we would have spent in that later drafting session. So we're just, I think, swapping time right now. I don't think we're getting to the point where we're worried if we're going to get finished today. I think we got plenty of time to finish up all these things.
Okay.
But it does mean that we may, you know, we'll see where we get with the presentation on the harvest strategy policy. But I think it's good to work out the rest of these few paragraphs. And I see your comment in the chat, or your
They're mostly on the what are now I think paragraph 37, 39, and then 41.
Okay.
But happy to pick up wherever you see fit. And I see Michelle's hands up in the comments as well, or in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks. This gets to, I guess, the comment that Jim Lane made earlier, and the last question that that Gwen posed in the chat about trying a triennial assessment for one cycle. And I guess first I just want to clarify that I'm not at all opposed to doing a triennial assessment or changing the assessment frequency or trying it as a pilot and seeing how it goes. I'm more just wanting to make sure I have a clear understanding of what is going to happen during those non-assessment years and how the TCEY would be set. And then just understanding what is that going to mean in terms of variability over the long term, and how often might we see large changes as a result of not assessing every year. So again, not opposed to it, but just want to better understand kind of how we envision it working, even just for the pilot, and then understanding that things are going to change and evolve as we learn from that pilot, but at least just understanding what the initial might be. And then in addition to that, I did have a question on paragraph 37. And this gets to the different FIS designs. And with the SPR at 43% and the average TCEY declining by 450,000 pounds, moving from the base block design to the core block design. And I'm wondering if that is a result of just how the TCEY is set and the assumptions that are made for the areas that are not surveyed by the FIS. And so I'm just trying to reconcile how the decline occurs, and is there a way to not have that coast-wide decline? Is it a matter of being more strategic and selective in the areas that are surveyed during specific years? Or is it a matter of changing the assumptions that are made about the unsurveyed areas? So anyway, anything you can provide in that regard would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I totally understand your concerns with the triennial assessment, and what I made a note to bring that into the interim and annual meetings in the presentation. With regard to paragraph 37, I think that's a really good point. And I think that is the key behind all of this, is the base block design is a design that eventually surveys all the areas and it's an unbiased design in the way that it operates. But it does survey less areas than what we call like the base design, which would be all survey stations or almost all survey stations every year. So moving to the core block design is that reduction in, or some areas are not surveyed for long periods of time. And so some bias can creep in there. And so these reductions are really getting at the fact that those areas are not being surveyed and there's a lot less sampling going on. So there's more uncertainty and potential bias. So what I sort of maybe am confused about with your question is the question is there ways we can be more strategic about, surveying these areas? That is moving back to the base block design. There's been a lot of work done before this MSE work was on rationalizing the survey and finding the designs that would work. And I think we've gotten as strategic as we can. And the real key now is we just need to get as close to a base block design as we can, because that's the most sort of efficient, rationalized, unbiased design possible, which is actually a little bit more uncertainty than, if we were able to survey all areas and all stations. So I think this analysis is actually getting at your question. It's just not phrased in the way that you're thinking about it. And maybe we could wordsmith it, but one thing is there, I think some thought from MSAB members that this is not a necessary paragraph to even have in the report. So I think the first thing we have to decide is, one, do we want something on these different design analysis in the MSE and the MSAB report, noting it is in the SRB report. And two, if we do have something along this lines, do we want to bring that concept in that the core block design is not surveying all areas in every year, and that these losses are a result of not surveying those areas and bias being introduced and higher uncertainty.
Yeah, thanks. I guess what I'm struggling with, and I'm fine however the MSAB decides whether or not to include this in our report, but just that the TCEY, the average coastwide TCEY, is a calculation. And so what I'm hearing from you is that as we deviate from the ideal FIS design that has the lowest bias, and as we introduce additional biases, that there's some threshold of where the uncertainty is too large, and that is what is causing the TCEY to decline.
I don't think it's a threshold. I think regardless, as you, even if you reduce the sampling and the base block design, that there probably would be a loss in the TCY due to the uncertainty. And that's sort of the key result here, is that the worse survey you have, the lower your TCY is going to be. The better your survey you have, if you want to put an optimistic point of view, the better survey you have, the more yield will be gained. And whether that's bias or uncertainty, I think it holds. How much yield is gained is a different story on that. But it's trying to just show the worth of the FIS and what is the worth of the FIS, because right now the commission is struggling with having a revenue neutral survey. And because it's hard to have a revenue neutral, how much money do we have to bring in to get a base block design? And that's millions of dollars. But what's the gain in terms of supplementing the survey with extra money? And that's where we're trying to get to with here. So I don't think there's a threshold where the survey operates just fine. It's almost like it's just a sliding scale of, good versus bad surveys.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. And I guess what in my opinion, what's missing from 37 is that description of how additional uncertainty is introduced with these different FIST designs, and that is what is causing the TCEY decline.
Would it be helpful to have a paragraph before just describing the 3 designs?
Yes, but I also think some explanatory reason of why the average coastwide TCEY declines and making sure it's clear that it's as a result of increased uncertainty.
Okay, I'm just going to put in a note here for now because I think we need to back up and see if the MSAB actually wants to keep this sentence, this paragraph in the report. Any thoughts on removing this paragraph from the report? I know yesterday during the drafting session that was discussed whether this was important or not.
We have a couple of hands up. I'm not sure if they're to answer that question that you just posed, but we do have Tom and Michael's hands up.
Okay, I guess I'm a little puzzled. It seems like we're kind of diverging in 2 different directions. I mean, here we're worried about a 1%, which is whether it would be a 1% decline in the TCEY by going to a block design of 450,000 pounds, whatever. But earlier in the report, we're concerned about wanting to reduce our fishing intensity from 43 to 46, even higher than that, because we never will take 46. We'll always be 2 or 3% above that. So, we're concerned about wanting to move, up to B40 and essentially reduce fishing pressure. And yet here we're so concerned about, we're going to reduce the TCEY by 1% by changing a FIST design. It just seems like, what are we concerned about here? I mean, this, if nothing else, it'd be like a 1% buffer. You're going to be a little less pressure on the fish, which, from the Commission's point, it seems like they've kind of seen the 23 level as a floor level. They don't want to go below that. So if we leave a little 1% buffer, I mean, at this point in time, I don't see what the problem with that is. It's, so I guess I don't see what this paragraph really adds to the report, or if it really matters that much, in my opinion. So anyway, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Good points.
Michael, go ahead. It looks like your mic is on, Michael, but I can't hear you. I'm not sure if other folks can.
No, I'm not hearing them right now. It's not, something's going on with your microphone, Michael. Yeah.
Try it now.
Yep, that works.
Okay. With the increase or the decrease in the TECY being affected by the uncertainty, is it possible to redirect the funds not spent on the annual frequency assessment to put more money into the FIS? So yes, it won't still not, it's not revenue neutral, but that would decrease your uncertainty.
Yeah, I think the way that the budget is structured, that wouldn't be possible. And also, the triennial, moving to a triennial assessment frequency would not result in less or cost savings, because the assessment is done by just the Secretary of Staff. So we'd have to hire and fire staff every 3rd year, which I don't think would be possible. But the real benefit of a triennial assessment frequency would be the additional time for research to improve the assessment process. But yeah, I don't think we would have a cost savings from the triennial assessment frequency that could then go into the survey.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep, but it's good thinking because we need that sort of out of the box type of thinking right now with all these budget concerns. Why don't we move on from these? People can think about this. I added this paragraph 38, which was when the computer crashed, was what I was adding. And this was just noting that the analysis of the triennial assessment frequency with reduced FIS designs were not analyses were not completed. And that the increased uncertainty in the FIS 030 WPUE with reduced designs would result in an increased interannual variability in the coastwide TCY, especially in non-assessment years, which rely on that to determine the reference coastwide TCY. Reading that paragraph, I feel like I'm almost getting into what Michelle was asking for a little bit more explanation. So I think it would be good to think about this. But in the interest of time, I'm really, really super interested in getting to the harvest strategy policy because I think that is the most important part of this meeting, actually. Is it okay if we move on and then consider these two paragraphs when we come back into the drafting session later?
Yes.
Okay. Tom, is that still a hand up or is that left over from your previous comment? If so, just feel free to jump in. 39 is the non-economic value of the FIS, and it could be useful for the commission to be aware of the MSAB's thoughts here. I think this is a useful paragraph. And I think the MSAB and the stakeholders are the groups that can, really have a say to the commissioners that there's a lot of importance to the FIS other than just using it in the stock assessment. So, any thoughts on that? And the other thing is the next paragraph 40 is decision-making variability is an important component, but it's difficult to model and bias because it's unknown in the future and may differ from the past. I think that's just a useful statement to note in, trying to interpret these results. Okay, that brings us to 41 and 42, which are potential recommendations. And again, I think that we should move on. We'll read through these now and people can have a little bit more thought about this. There's a lot of good discussion this morning already about that could feed into these. And so a potential recommendation is to change the management procedure or what determines the reference coastwide TCY. And we've talked about SPR 46% and we've talked about a triennial stock assessment. I think constraints are off of the table at this point. There's just too much uncertainty and weirdness going on in there. And so if the MSAB is interested in adjusting that reference management procedure, that, we can put in a paragraph like this. And then a following paragraph might be like 42, where the MSAB makes recommendations to further evaluation. So identifying specific management procedure elements that they want. Somebody's on. If you can please mute. Thanks. And so unless someone has a comment. Yeah, I see Tom's hand still up. I think that's just left over, but Forrest.
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit on too much weird stuff going on with constraints and why we're dropping constraints from consideration in an MP?
I'm not saying to drop constraints from consideration. I'm just saying it might not be the right time to recommend that a constraint be put into the MP, the reference MP at this time. But the constraints can certainly come in down here in paragraph what's 42 right now. And the weirdness that was going on was, one, a constraint reduced the TCY, reduced the AAV, but understanding why that happened, we just haven't dug into those details and really got a good understanding of why that's occurring. And then with the triennial, some really weird behavior was going on. The TCY was really super low, and I need to check those results.
So is this paragraph then saying the MSAB recommended further consideration of an or further runs, or like, how would the commission read this? Like, we are putting forward the idea that we should have an NP with a triennial stock assessment and an SPR 46. What message are we sending with this paragraph, I guess, is my
That's
question.
a good point. I think the message here is this is the paragraph where the MSAB is recommending a new management procedure.
Okay, I guess I could be in support of it as long as, like, following paragraphs or somewhere in here, we don't omit consideration of constraints, but that they just need further analysis before they can be incorporated.
Yep, I'm going to put that note down there. So this is a big recommendation, that the current SPR 43% be changed, and the triennial stock assessment frequency occur. So maybe we can think about this and see if if the MSAB is willing to support a statement like this, or remove the triennial and just move to an SPR 46%. Maybe make another comment about, further investigations and further evaluations down in 42. So before we move on, any other comments on these last two paragraphs?
Just quickly, we don't really need to get into them right now, but I think something for folks to chew on, for when we come back to these in the later drafting session. I put these comments in the chat, but I think it's worth kind of putting them out loud. We've already kind of touched on, is this a pilot? Is this not a pilot? Or do we want to explore in a pilot? But a couple of other things is consideration of, if we did move to a triennial assessment, would that be on the same timeline as the full reviews that get done? And then what would that mean for an annual meeting? Would that be completely overwhelming to have both at the same time? Is it possible to have them staggered? How would that work? How would that look? So just something to kind of chew on. And then I think also, if this is the recommendation that we end up making, I think it would be really important, not necessarily maybe in this paragraph, but maybe in a subsequent paragraph, of kind of clearly indicating, as much as we know, what tools and metrics the commissioners would have available to them in the interim years for their decision-making processes. I know we touched on it a little bit yesterday, in kind of intervening years. What information do we have from the FIS that would kind of go into the decision-making processes at the annual meeting? But I think it would be quite helpful for commissioners to have that spelled out, or at least that, like, we are considering what metrics would be available in intervening years.
Yeah, so that would be great for the report, and those sorts of details would also go into the harvest strategy policy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Any other thoughts on these right now, recognizing we'll come back to these? I think these are very important, and we really want to get consensus from the MSAB on both of these recommendations.
I'm not seeing any other hands.
Okay, thanks. So I think with that brings us to agenda item 5. And I would like to have at least an hour for this. So I'm wondering if we can extend this session and maybe break for lunch closer to 12:30. Is anybody opposed to a lunch break at 12:30? Or even 1 if people really want. I don't know what people have planned for their afternoon, but I know what I have planned. It's called report writing.
I think shifting to to a 12:30 lunch is likely doable.
Okay, we'll see where we get to with this. And wow, this is doing crazy things. Okay, so if the Secretariat could bring up presentation 07, that would be great. Excellent. Okay, so agenda item 5, document 07, and this is a discussion of the draft interim harvest strategy policy document. So yesterday, Chris mentioned that it would be useful to see the commission directives from the work meeting. And I do apologize, Chris, I didn't end up showing it yesterday as you asked, but here it is in this presentation on slide 2. So we had an extensive discussion at the work meeting with the commissioners about the draft harvest strategy policy. And they had a number of directives, and I'll just summarize them quickly. One, they wanted the harvest strategy policy to capture the commission's intent that outcomes of the management procedure are non-prescriptive advice that preserves the commissioner's prerogative to account for other relevant factors during the annual decision-making process on coastwide TCY and the distribution of the TCY to regulatory areas. So that language is very clear now in the draft. And the draft has been updated since the work meeting and then for this MSAB meeting. So the draft you have available to you reflects these directives. This is a really important concept from the commission, indicating that they want this as a reference or management input into their decision-making process. And it maybe I was making an assumption, but it was clear that the commission may exceed the reference TCY too. And what they asked for, you'll see down here. In B, uses the MP output as a reference value for the harvest decision table, thereby providing a range of coastwide TC options associated risks. And that reference value would sort of be a middle point of the harvest decision table. So they would be considering TCYs lower than or higher than the reference MP value. And that's where, when we were talking about a maximum fishing intensity, that's where that comes in. Let's see, presents a method to link long-term consequences of fishing intensity options determined from the MSE to TCY options presented in the decision table. And we've been discussing this with the SRB. And one option would just be to show some of the performance metrics from the MSE for the different SPR rates that are presented in the decision table. And then variances in the commission's annual decisions have been incorporated into simulation testing. And this is that, the decision-making variabilities included in the simulations, and that's described in the harvest strategy policy. That this a draft is submitted as a working document to MSAB020, which has been done. And then that after, a draft is submitted for the 100th IM for their consideration and discussion by the commission at that point in time. And so any recommendations coming out of the MSAB020 can be incorporated into a draft, and a revision paper can be submitted for the commission to consider. So those were the directives from there. And I think they've all, once we get to the interim meeting, they'll all have been met. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about the harvest strategy policy and what it generally is, and then go through and a brief description of each of the different chapters. So harvest strategy policy is a framework for applying a consistent, transparent, science-based approach to setting mortality limits while ensuring sustainability. And it has a number of different concepts and benefits to it, like ensuring long-term sustainability and profitability. It accounts for risks and balances trade-offs, which you're all very aware of. We've been doing that this whole meeting. Allows for implementation of the precautionary approach and all these different concepts of it. But I want you to be aware that the harvest strategy policy is not replacing any sort of other documentation or protocols or conventions of the IPHC. This is just a document that, along with these other important agreements, such as the protocol amending the convention, provide the basis to manage risk for Pacific halibut fisheries and the population. So it's a document that basically explains the process that IPHC does. And it's really important because a harvest strategy policy is very common in fisheries management. And I think almost every organization that manages fisheries has something similar to this. We have in the United States, we have the Magnuson-Stevens Act, we have the Fisheries Act and Sustainable Fisheries Framework in Canada. We have tuna fisheries that are adopting harvest strategies, and you can go to harveststrategies.org to see a lot of this. And harveststrategies.org is actually keeping an eye on IPHC for what they're doing with a harvest strategy as well. And then many countries have similar things. New Zealand has their own harvest policy document, and then they have a technical document also describing the technical details of their harvest strategy policy. Australia has one. And so, all these countries have some sort of framework. And I think it's very important for IPHC to adopt one for various reasons. So IPHC has actually been operating under an interim HSP or harvest strategy policy for since I've been here for 8 years. But they have not formally endorsed a harvest strategy policy. So this provides complications when, say, the Marine Stewardship Council comes and talks to me and Dr. Stewart and Dr. Wilson and says, "So, what is your policy here? What's your are you following the policy?" And it's like, "Well, we don't have an adopted one, but this is sort of how we've been operating." And they give us some funny looks and like, "Okay, we'll accept that." But it's I think useful to have this because those certification agencies will certainly be looking for this in the future. So the interim harvest strategy policy has not been formally documented and endorsed by the commission. And so that is really the goal of this whole process, is to have a harvest strategy policy in place for the IPHC. So we showed this plot yesterday, or this figure, this illustration of the annual mortality limit setting process, and talking about the coastwide scale over on the left, how data collection feeds into an annual coastwide stock assessment, and then it uses a fishing intensity, which is all determined from the MSE work and other work done on that on the harvest policy aspect of it. That determines a total mortality and then a coastwide TCY. And this is where that coastwide TCY, this is the reference, I should probably call it a reference there, is feeding into the decision-making process of the commission. Now, many harvest strategy policies would output this, and that would be the end of the story. That's the rules, and they go into regulations. But the commission here wants all that management supporting information, decision tables, mortality tables, input from the different bodies to inform their decision-making process and then decide on regulatory area mortality limits. So this is a decision-making process, and this is the management procedure over on the left. So we've really tried to just explain this process in the harvest strategy policy document. Some definitions that are useful to have. One, what is a management procedure? And that's a formulaic procedure to determine a management outcome, such as the coastwide TCY, and that it has been simulation tested and can produce a repeatable outcome. That means you know how to reproduce that outcome. It has a formula associated with it. The harvest strategy, the definition we're using, is it's the whole framework for managing the fish stock, includes the management procedure as well as the objective. So it's bringing in the objectives part of it too. And then the policy, the harvest strategy policy, is the entire process of the harvest strategy, the management procedure, as well as that decision-making process that results in the endpoint management outcomes, and that's those TCUIs by regulatory area. So what is management supporting information? And that any sort of information that assists the commission in their decision-making process. That can include the decision table from the stock assessment, mortality tables, the FIS, a look at FIS results by region, by regulatory area. It also includes stakeholder testimonies. It includes recommendations from the CB and the PAB, et cetera. So, you know, any sort of information feeding into that decision-making process. All right, so let's walk through the chapters of the harvest strategy policy. There's 4 chapters in it. And chapter 1 is just really an introduction to what is a harvest strategy policy. And it encompasses the entire process of the management procedure and decision-making process to determine mortality limits, as well as other important considerations such as the objectives, the key principles, and responses to specific events. And it also notes that due to this decision-making process, the final coast-wide mortality limit may deviate from the reference determined by the management procedure. So that's really it. Those are the key points in chapter 1, and it's just that introduction. So it's defining the decision framework and what is necessary to achieve biological and economic objectives. It's talking about objectives and key principles, reference points. This is the whole harvest strategy. The process for monitoring and assessing the halibut population, and then any predetermined rules that might adjust fishing mortality, like the 30-20 control rule. So it's a description of all of these different things in one document, and that's why I think it's very important, because there really is nowhere right now where we have a description of these, such as the reference point, the control rule, and other things like that. So given that introduction, it identified a number of different features which are covered in the next chapters. Chapter 2 is really discussing the objectives and the key principles. And so chapter 2 is where these objectives come in. And these are actually the 4 priority objectives of the commission, shown on this slide. And this is where the MSAB has a lot of influence in making recommendations to the commission on what they think are the most important objectives to manage the Pacific halibut stock with. So a lot of our work today will influence this chapter and could potentially make changes to this chapter, such as changing optimize to maximize potentially. In chapter 2 is also a definition of overfished and overfishing. And so overfished is currently defined as when the estimated probability that the female relative spawning biomass is below the limit reference point, and that's greater than a 50% chance of being below that limit reference point. So you see this is slightly different than the objective. The limit reference points is the RSB 20%, and the objective is you don't want to be below it more than 5% of the time. But we want to be able to declare the stock as overfished and take action to get out of that point if it is estimated to be below that with a greater than 50% chance.
We have a hand up from Chris.
Yep. Hey, Chris.
Hey, just on the overfishing, where the stock is subject to a level of fishing, are we talking about fishing intensity, or are we talking about, I guess we'd have to be talking about fishing intensity, wouldn't we?
So that's a really good point, Chris. And there's still a little bit more work to do on overfishing. So we see in red, it still has to be, probabilities still have to be determined. But one thing that we really want to be cognizant of that we've been thinking and, presenting in this harvest strategy policy is that what really does overfishing mean? And does that mean if you're fishing at a value greater than your fishing intensity? So for example, in the US, if you're fishing at a value greater than the SPR that determines the OFL, you're declared as overfishing. But the one issue with that is, let's say you find a brand new stock of fish at its virgin level, and you want to go and fish it down to MSY value. Well, you have to fish it down slowly because you're not allowed to fish greater than your current fishing intensity, where you might want to fish it down at a faster rate and fish above that fishing intensity. Also, given the commission's desire to have this flexibility and make decisions that might, the TCY may be above the reference fishing intensity, we wanted to really have a definition here where overfishing means that you're moving to an overfish state pretty quickly, or you're not rebuilding it out of an overfish state. So we're working on this definition, exactly how to implement that and allow the flexibility of the commission to potentially exceed a reference fishing intensity.
Okay, so but it when we say subject to a level of fishing, we're talking about fishing intensity.
Yes, and that could be a level of fishing that in the next 3 years moves it to undesirable state, for example.
The only thing is, just given what else is in the document where they talk about fishing intensity, do you think it makes sense to put in subject to a level of fishing bracket fishing, e.g. fishing intensity? That would, just so it's clear to the reader, or maybe that's something that you're still working on.
That's a really good point. And yeah,
just something to think about. It's just when I was reading the document, I'm looking at this and I was like, level of fishing, does he mean fishing intensity, or is it something else? That's all. And maybe it is something else, but if it is fishing intensity, then I think putting it in brackets afterwards would make it consistent with some of the text in the draft document.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I'll definitely take note of that. Yeah, and the MSAB can also request that as well. That could be a request of the MSAB. All right, so that's some definitions of overfished and overfishing, and those are still in flux. So we want to make sure we really dial those in and they make a lot of sense. So we've been discussing those with the commission as well as the SRB. So that's chapter 2. And again, chapter 2 is just the objectives and those key principles. Those are some of the highlights from it. Chapter 3 is a bit more extensive, and that discusses how the harvest strategy policy was developed. And the development of the harvest strategy policy is what you all are very familiar with. That's what has been considered in the development of the harvest strategy policy. What are some of the principles, such as monitoring, standards, for example? What are reference points and proxies? How's the evaluation occurred? And when is the harvest strategy and the management procedure reevaluated? Is that on a certain time frame, or where do the exceptional circumstances come in? So I'm going to walk through a few key elements of this chapter. And the first one are the reference points. And a reference point, and its general definition, is it's a specified level of an indicator used as a basis for management. And they reflect acceptable levels of biological impact and desired economic outcomes. So we have these threshold reference point, and the threshold is currently defined as the maximum economic yield, the RSB associated with MEY. And so that concept would actually go into this harvest strategy policy. And then there's a proxy, a 36%, which we've been discussing actually this morning about that. Now, we've defined this as a threshold reference point. We could potentially, if the MSAB was, adamant on changing the threshold used as the objective, we could have a threshold reference point that's an RSB 40%, for example, and then have another reference point that's RSB MEY. So that's not a problem. We can always define these things as necessary to match or be congruent with the management procedure and the objectives and the desires of the commission. The biological limit reference point, though, is something, you know, we've decided on as 20% relative spawning biomass. And that's definitely a place that would be regarded as unacceptable to be. And so that's our overfished point as well. Okay, so that's reference points for technical evaluation and reevaluating. Well, you're all very familiar with the MSE process, and so that's described here, as well as exceptional circumstances. And what we're going to do is add in the recommendation from the SRB on an exceptional circumstance related to the realized coastwide catch. And then the responses, if an exceptional circumstance is triggered, are also outlined exactly how is this reevaluation done at that time. In this section also should be, if not, I can't remember, but how often is the MSE process redone, even without an exceptional circumstance? And that's very common, you know, 3 to 5 years. And what we have thought is every time there's an updated assessment, which occurs every 3rd year, that the MSE process is at least looked at, and the operating model is reevaluated, and we just make sure that things are still in line. So that was a couple key points from chapter 3. And then chapter 4 is really the meat of the document, and that's really how is the harbor strategy policy applied. So I should note in chapter 3 is also a description of decision-making variability and how that is brought into the simulations as well. So applying the harbor strategy policy involves a number of different things beyond just the management procedure, including how we coordinate the management of domestic stocks. This, you know, will have some description of that, and then how we coordinate management of international stocks. And this is definitely not meant to replace the protocol and all that, but it's just a brief description. And it's more high level saying, you know, the IPHC will do what is necessary to have agreement and things like that. It discusses the stock assessment, how that occurs. It's not going to be in depth, but it's just a really high level. There's a stock assessment. It takes all the data, you know, available, integrates it, and is updated has a full update every 3 years. And so this is where now, if a triennial stock assessment was to occur, this would be described in this process. And then the coastwide reference mortality limit is described, and that's where you would describe, you know, the stock assessment determines it from these fishing intensities, or in a triennial sense, it follows the FIS 032 WPOE, for example. Rebuilding mortality limits within each IPHC regulatory area. And I just want to note that, you know, as part of the decision-making process, and that's basically what is described there. But it's important to have this section in the harbor strategy policy because that is the end result, right? This harbor strategy policy really is describing to that endpoint management outcome. How stakeholder and science are input into the process, and then the annual process, you know, describes the meeting process and the different stakeholder bodies and how they can input into that process. So, for example, in chapter 4, it describes the management procedure, which has this harvest control rule, which is then considered further during the decision-making process. And this figure shows this 30-20 control rule, where we have the reference fishing intensity, which is the SPR 43% currently. And when the stock status is good, we're operating at that fishing intensity. But we have SPR being low fishing intensity on the bottom, high fishing intensity on top. And if the stock status is below its trigger reference point, 30% there, it declines. And if it's below its limit reference point, basically nearly all fisheries are shut down from fishing. That's how this control rule operates. And so that's the harvest control rule that's described in this section. You notice here is the threshold or what we're calling the BMEY as a threshold reference point. And it's saying, you know, we want to be above that point 50% of the time, which is why it's okay to be in here. But, you know, it's like, no, we don't want to be there more than 50% of the time. So another important part of this is rebuilding. What if the stock is determined to be overfished? What if that relative spawning biomass is below 20% and the median relative spawning biomass is below 20%? Then a rebuilding strategy must be developed to rebuild the stock to above its limit reference point, and that's done by agreement by the commission, exactly how that rebuilding strategy would occur. And that would be required until the stock is above that limit with a higher level of certainty. So at least 70% probability that the stock is above that limit reference point, because you don't want it to be a 51% chance and the next assessment says, oh, now it's a 49% chance. So we're back in the overfish. So we want to make sure we're really out of that overfish state. It must describe monitoring, data collection, but important is what is the rebuilding time frame? And there's no specific advice in the harvest strategy policy on what that time frame is, but that is something that could be worked on or just agreed upon by the commission in that they want the stock to be rebuilt within some certain amount of time. Let's hope we never have to get to that point. The mortality limits for each IPHC regulatory area, like I said, this is important to include in this harvest strategy policy because it's the final output before domestic management is applied. So this is really the final output of management from the IPHC, and these are the tables that occur in the annual meeting report. And then this is also what's described here is that this is a commission decision point, and there's a lot of input and management supporting information. And we're working on describing all those different sources of management supporting information, which are mortality tables, decision table, could be the FIS, different looks at how the FIS by region, by regulatory area, et cetera. So that is basically a real brief summary of the harvest strategy policy. It's not a hard read. It's not too long. So I think it's a very useful document. It's described in these different chapters as well. And there's still some modifications. And so that the next steps of this are one for the MSAB to provide recommendations to the commission and to the Secretariat. And some of those recommendations can be edits to the harvest strategy policy. We heard one already, maybe just, defining an extent, that its fishing intensity is really what level of fishing means. That's a useful thing. And so in the report could be a number of requests for different edits to this document. And another potential recommendation to the commission from the MSAB is that they consider this harvest strategy policy for endorsement, that the MSAB is looking at this as a useful document to have in the IPHC process. And really, I think the MSAB should see this, if a document like this was adopted, this should be a point of celebration for the MSAB. This is a huge success of the MSAB and the MSE process. It really fed into this, the development of this harvest strategy policy. It would not have been possible without the input of the MSAB. It would have been possible, but I bet not as many people would be happy with it, or at least not mad at it. So, and that's the goal, I think, for me, is for most people to be not mad at it. So once the MSAB considers this document, is the commission then will discuss this at the IM 100, and then we'll consider for endorsement at the annual meeting, the 101st annual meeting. And that will be another point of celebration if a document like this is endorsed by the commission, noting that this document can be updated in the future and that there's still some work to do on this document. So it's not like this is a final document that goes into stone. This is a document that can be amended based on recommendations from the commission that are supported by requests and recommendations from the MSAB, from the SRB, and then research by the Secretariat. So that's the next steps and in this process, and a really exciting time for me especially, and I think it should be an exciting time for all MSAB members, past and present, because this is really the you know, a milestone in the work that we've been doing over the last 11 years, I guess. All right, so that's the end of that presentation, and that went quite smoothly, but I think you know, we have time for discussion on that, and then we can work on drafting any sort of recommendations in the draft report, which I don't think there's necessarily needs to be a lot of recommendations, but if there's comments on edits to it, and then if the MSAB wants to make a recommendation for the commission to consider this, we can put that in. And other than that, oh, I see a hand from Kurt. Great, thanks, Kurt.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Thanks for the presentation and all the great descriptions. One thing I was curious about, because this I think goes before my time, we have this interim harvest strategy policy, and can you help explain some background on why it has remained an interim policy? Up until now, why has the commission not adopted it? Have they ever provided any sort of rationale, or could you give me some sense of history here?
Yeah, so when I came along in 2016, they were operating under this concept called the blue line, which I never really did understand, and that's fine because we didn't operate under that for very long. We the Secretariat was supporting and the SRB was supporting this SPR-based approach, and the Commission adopted that SPR-based approach in I think 2017. And with a reference SPR 46% at that time, which was basically just an average of the last 3 years, the fishing intensity they had adopted over the last 3 years, because we hadn't done any MSE work at that time. So really, it's been this harvest strategy policy has developed over time, over the last over time, but really the specifics of it over the last 7 or 8 years through different adoptions and recommendations that have occurred at the annual meetings. So the MSE work then came along and supported the SPR 43% at that time. And the MSAB made a recommendation to move toward that. The commission considered it, and the commission decided to adopt an SPR 43%. And based on various things such as interannual variability, yield, and all those other things. And so that was adopted through an intersessional decision. So really this harvest strategy policy has been formed through all these sort of decision-making points in the commission's history, but it hasn't been formally documented. And I think the delay in the adoption of this document has been, it's just the document needs to be formed. And you saw with report writing this morning, it takes a lot of time to make sure the language is correct, because this is an official document now. And so we just want to make sure it's correct. So it's been evolving. We've had this in place and for a number of years. I think 2019 was the first draft. And then last year we updated it extensively and added a lot of sections. And you see there's still some incomplete sections. So I think that's why it hasn't been formally adopted by the commission. And what we're asking the commission to do is to endorse this draft, recognizing that it will be updated in the future to reflect future decisions, as well as to fill in some of those missing points. So is that helpful, Kurt?
That was very helpful. Thank you. That was exactly what I was looking for.
Okay, thanks. And I'm happy to talk about it some more whenever you want, and hopefully we can see each other in person and chat about these things.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments on the harvest strategy policy? Again, this is really, I see it as the you know, a real shining light of the progress and the MSAB and what the MSAB was able to achieve. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Hicks. So on top of page 15 of the draft, it talks about IPHC currently operates on a schedule of 3 years for full stock assessment with update stock assessments intervening 2 years. Now, if we move to triennial assessments, would this need to be updated to reflect that with you'd have to you would have to specify, or are we considering using the FIS and update stock assessment using the FIS to adjust the TCY? Like, does that still reflect if we move to a triennial assessment? Does that need to be reworded?
Yeah, and thanks, Chris. That is an example I wanted to bring up and how this document would be updated with given recommendations from the MSAB that would then, be adopted by the commission. So in that case, this is describing, let's see, yeah. So with update stock assessments and intervening 2 years, it's describing the stock assessment process, saying there will be a stock assessment. If a triennial stock assessment frequency was to be adopted, we'd change this wording to maybe say, the IPHC operates under schedule 3 years, every 3 years for a full stock assessment. With intervening years, the TCY is determined based on FIS 032 WPOE. It'd be much better wording than that, but yeah, you're exactly right. This wording would be changed, and so that's why this is a dynamic document. It's not going to be set in stone. This isn't the decision to make today, but if the commission says, you know what, there's a better way to manage this stock, now let's consider it in the harvest strategy policy, and we'll put that in. And I think it'll be easier to do that once this document is adopted, because it'll be a document, and then any sort of decision that's made by the commission will then just be reflected back into this document. Right now, we're trying to get this document as part of the documents within the commission. So I think once we get past that point, it'll just be as simple. Every time there's a commission decision for something, we just go in and modify the language to reflect that decision.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up, Chris. We're not looking for the commission to set something in stone right now, and there's still work for the MSAB to do. So don't worry, you're not out of the clear yet. It's still more MSE work for me to do too, so that feels good for me. But having this document in place just gives a document for certification agencies to look at. I get a lot of requests from different researchers at universities. They're saying, wait, how does it operate at IPHC? And I'm like, well, let's have lunch and sit down and talk about it. But now I don't have to buy them lunch. I can just give them the document. Wait, they should buy me a lunch. So, this document's just going to explain a lot and be a really open our process here and make it much more transparent, and really identify it as a scientifically valid process, how we're managing Pacific halibut. Any other thoughts on the document or the harvest strategy policy? With that, think about if there's any edits you want to this document, we can bring those into the report writing session. And if there's no more comments on this agenda item, I'd like to turn it over to the chairs to determine where to go next. There's 2 more agenda items, other business and review of the draft and then adoption of the report. And I think that we should have another drafting session where we consider some things that we missed in the report that we need to get back to, and then draft any of the further paragraphs for the harvest strategy policy and other business agenda items. Under other business, I was thinking we can talk about the 2025 meeting schedule and see what the MSAD would like to recommend to the commission.
Thanks, Alan. My thoughts are, let's move on to other business so we can kind of check that off, and it's not something that we need to worry about when we break or we come back from lunch, and we can really dedicate post lunch to hashing out the report draft.
I agree. I think that's a great plan.
Cool. So I saw in the chat there were a couple comments about the usefulness of two meetings, two MSAB meetings in the year. This was a busy year. There were a lot of results to consider. It was very helpful for the Secretariat to have that spring MSAB meeting to get the recommendations and what to do for their summer vacation. And then have that October meeting to then present the results for evaluation as we've done here and really get those MSAB recommendations. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that and see if the floor is open to anybody having comments about how many meetings and when they might occur.
As a relative newcomer, I found having two meetings this year quite helpful. As you noted, Alan, there was a lot to cover this year, particularly for the goals that we have coming up at the annual meeting. I think it's helpful to have the kind of regular spring meeting, but then also have a follow-up kind of around this time before we get into the interim meeting and the annual meeting. I'm not sure we'll have kind of the same amount of work on the plate for next year. But personally, I would go for having a secondary fall meeting again, even if it's just kind of a refresh information out. What did we cover? So we're kind of all on the same page and refreshed going into the big fall meetings. I see Jim and Michelle. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I agree with Gwen. I mean, having one meeting a year, I think we did it once or twice. It's just, we might have a quick update in May. Just, no, it was just too hard to catch up again and to get your brain kind of focused around issues and things. It would be nice to be in person once in a while, because these are brutal at the times. But yeah, regardless of what kind of format they are, I think I agree with what Gwen's points.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Michelle, go ahead.
Thanks. I agree with both. I think if we don't have two meetings, it's a very long time in between meetings, and we tend to spend a lot of that time just catching up and refreshing on where we left things off. So I think it's actually more efficient to have two meetings, as Jim suggested, even if it's just a check-in informational type meeting without any major decisions that need to be made by the MSAB. I would also support having at least one of those meetings be in person, maybe our May meeting. I think a couple of thoughts. One is just the complexity of the material that we're dealing with, and it certainly helps me to be able to interact with other MSAB members and catch them during breaks, or just bouncing off different ideas or making sure I'm understanding things correctly. And I think that also would make the meeting more efficient instead of taking up everybody's time with kind of those questions that I could get addressed on the side. I'll also say that it's especially challenging for me to do these from home when I'm so readily available to address family matters at the same time and having to work late on MSAB. So having the ability to go off-site from my house to attend an MSAB meeting certainly helps me from a participation standpoint. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle and Jim. I really echo those. I really like to have these meetings in person because of, and we used to schedule the in-person meetings with half an hour breaks and things like that, because I think a lot of the work actually got done during the break and during the lunch, during those discussions. Things are understood better. You can ask a question. I can ask my stupid questions to people without being embarrassed to having to ask it to everybody. So yeah, I would agree with that. One question I have for people to think about is where would be a good place for a meeting. I mean, we used to hold them here at headquarters in Seattle, the IPHC headquarters in Seattle, in the training room, which worked fine. But I really enjoyed the meeting that was in Sitka one year for a number of reasons. One, I felt like I was getting out in the field a little bit. Two, we had involvement of stakeholders that I don't normally see. And three, I think it's just a little bit of outreach for IPHC. So those are the three aspects I've been thinking of. How many meetings in person is that useful, and then where? Go ahead, Kurt.
Yeah, for all the same reasons that you and Michelle just mentioned, I really appreciate the in-person meetings as well. I just find them more productive, and I know that any sort of recommendation though for in-person meetings is the first thing that commissioners are going to ask about is cost. To address some of those costs, I would hope that we point out that a good number of the MSAB members are primarily covered by the people who they represent. These can be agency people like myself or stakeholders who in other words, there would not be a direct cost to the IPHC. That doesn't cover everybody, but it does defray a good chunk of those costs. Laid over those costs is what you just said. Where would we hold it? So if we're holding it somewhere outside of IPHC headquarters, there's going to be a cost.
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental advantage of doing it. Somewhere where there is no cost, direct cost for renting a space. So that could happen, for example, again, at IPHC headquarters. It could happen, for example, here in Juneau at our NOAA facilities that we have here. It could probably happen somewhere in Canada for similar space. So I just raise those points that if we were going to, as a group, form a recommendation, we could get ahead of some of those concerns that the commissioners would raise, commissioners and of course Secretariat staff, by raising some of those issues. We would be willing to examine closely less expensive means to gather in person, because we all like to gather in person, but there will be at least some cost associated with that.
Thanks, Kurt. And I can vouch for similar facilities in Canada as well. DFO facilities, we have RHQ here in Vancouver that has decently sized boardrooms. There's also boardrooms in Nanaimo at PBS and in Victoria at iOS. So I think that is certainly an idea that I think is worth exploring. If in-person meetings in facilities that we have that aren't necessarily additional costs, like maybe like hosting at a hotel would be.
Yeah.
We could even do things like after the meetings, we could play rugby or something like that.
I'm all in.
A nod to good.
Thanks, Kurt. Appreciated. Tom, see your hand up.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thanks. Alan, I've been waiting a lot of years to see what you just presented, that harvest strategy, that policy. I think while it's not perfect and it's a work in progress, it's a huge step forward. And I've been waiting for years to see this brought forward. And thanks very much for bringing it. I think kudos to the group and you in particular for putting this up for recommendation so the board can adopt it, the commission can adopt it.
Yeah, well, thanks to you, Tom. You've been on since the beginning, longer than I have. Lynn made a point, in being mindful of council agendas and other agendas, and I do want to apologize. When I scheduled this MSAB meeting, I didn't look at the Board of Fish meeting schedule, and that's why Carla Bush was not here, which she did send an apology for. Yeah, so when scheduling a meeting, we want to be mindful of those things. So it might be useful when putting in a recommendation for a meeting to specify a more specific time for at least the May meeting, and then a specific time can be discussed in May. I noticed in the last couple of years, it's been uncertain whether we're having a fall meeting. And that's been a commission decision that's occurred after the spring MSAB meeting, which is why this one sort of got scheduled without a lot of consultation. So my apologies for that, but I do agree with you, Lynn. Having the dates would be useful so people can start scheduling it, and then being mindful of other organizations that already have their dates set. Kurt, did you have another comment? Nope. Okay. Oh, yeah. Michael, yeah, it was a little hard to hear you, Kurt, for some reason, that the microphone was coming in and out. But I think I'll summarize what Kurt was saying, Michael, and it's and Kurt, you can type them in the chat if you would like to. But basically, Kurt was very interested in getting ahead of the cost argument, and because if we just say, yeah, we want 2 meetings a year and in these remote Alaskan locations, that the commission would ask, well, that's a lot of cost and we have budget concerns. But getting ahead and saying, here's some solutions to reducing the cost. Agency personnel pay for themselves. We can hold it in places where the meeting room would have no cost, where people normally are, and there would be less hotel cost, et cetera. And I think that was the gist of it, that we just try to get ahead of that and provide some solutions to the cost issue and the reason that we've been having virtual meetings now. We did a cost analysis a couple of years ago on the MSAB, and I think it was like $40,000 to have a meeting in Seattle at IPHC. And that was one of the reasons the commission decided to go virtual, was because it was a cost savings avenue that they needed to reduce the budget with.
Thank you very much,
No problem.
Dr. Hicks. I couldn't really hear much.
Yeah, I was listening closely. You probably saw my face squinting in the camera. So, okay. Anything in other business? Any other discussion points? Does anybody want to bring up any potential dates of the MSAB in the spring? We typically have them in May. I know there's a MREP meeting that ends in early May, at the very beginning of May. And that is something that, I want to remain open for, but the middle and end of May are good for me. I think the MSAB was scheduled on opening day of lingcod season this year here in Puget Sound, so that wasn't good. So I'll have to look into that. And yeah, so if anybody has any meetings or dates in mind, did they prefer a May meeting that occurs just before the SRB, which occurs in June? Or is that when the season's going and people are unavailable? Any sort of thoughts on that would be probably useful as well.
The only thing that I will note is Monday, May 19th is a federal holiday in Canada.
May 19th. Yeah, and I think the next Monday is a federal holiday in the US.
So maybe Mondays are not a good idea.
Mondays are never a good idea.
No. We have Robert's hand and then Forrest's hand.
Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I just trying to remember. I thought we wanted to have a meeting in May before the SRB, so we could make some recommendations for the SRB to consider when they meet. So I'd be in favor of a May meeting or whenever everyone decides. But I think that was
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Thanks for the reminder, Robert. And I like that too. I like the process that we had this year where the MSAB comes in, makes some recommendations. The SRB is able to see those and say, yeah, good job, MSAB. Secretary goes away and does a bit of work. It's then scientifically reviewed by the SRB and then evaluated by the MSAB. And having it in that process, I think, really works well. So yeah, and I think May gives the Secretariat enough time after the annual meeting to make some progress, enough progress that it's informative for the MSAB. But I think holding it later in May, is starting to get too close to the SRB sometimes, which is this year we had it, I think, May 1st to 3rd.
Yeah, we had it at the very beginning of the month.
Mhm.
Seeing some dates come up in the chat of some no-go dates, which might
Okay.
help land on something. Emory isn't available the last week of May. There are some salmon meetings, and that might pull some Canadian reps away as well. And Lynn has conflicts through the first half of June.
Cool. Thanks, Lynn. That's really helpful.
I do see Forrest's hand up as well. Go ahead, Forrest.
Yeah, I do appreciate that you guys, especially that in person, that you avoid starting on a Monday to avoid travel. Appreciate that. And then, as early in May as possible, for at least for folks that are recreational fishing in Alaska, are getting geared up, and maybe I'm the only one out of this whole list, but that May 1 through 3 was doable, even if it had to slip back to I don't know what June 2nd is. June 1st is my birthday, but we can meet on my birthday. Yeah, even if we had to do like the last day of April and the first couple days or something, so it works, I would say right in that time frame rather than mid to late June for at least me. But
so what if the MSAB could just make a simple recommendation in the first 2 weeks or the first half of May or something like that, or during the week of May 5th, something like that?
Yeah, I was looking at either the week of April 28th that kind of crosses in between April and May, or the week of May 5th. Seems to be
April 28th is going to be the MREP, and the MREP is the Marine Resource Education Program, and that's where the stakeholders have the opportunity to go to this week-long retreat, sort of, that they learn about the fisheries management process, and IPHC is often involved with that, and some stakeholders are often involved with that as well.
Cool. All right, so not that week.
Yeah, but I think the week of the 5th or the 12th might be good weeks.
Yeah, if we're avoiding Mondays,
Yep.
and assuming that it would be a 2.5, 3-day meeting, looking at maybe the 6th, 7th, and 8th, or the 13th, 14th, 15th.
You mentioned a 2.5 or 3-day meeting. This was a 2-day meeting here. Did people find that was too rushed?
I just said 3-day meeting because I think our this past spring meeting was a bit longer.
Yep, it was. And I'm wondering if, would a spring 2-day meeting and a fall 3-day meeting be a better option? Or, I'm just curious what MSAB members think about the scheduling of these. Or just 2-day meetings. Was a 2-day meeting sufficient?
Well, it depends on the kind of how much material you have to go over, but I would rather have a 3-day in person than a 3-day virtual meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we can say something like a 2 to 3-day meeting.
Yeah, I think it's better to account for more time, and then we can pull back if we don't need that much time, rather than only accounting for 2 days and then we need more.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else in other business?
Dr. Hicks, it's Peggy again.
Hi, Peggy.
I wanted to just echo what Tom said earlier about the momentous occasion here, and thank everyone involved on it. And I also wanted to just at least offer an option that might not be great, but I can do a little more sleuthing and find out if there are places in Bellingham to have a meeting, which might be easier for a number of people who are members of the MSAB. And the last thing is, unfortunately, I have a doctor's appointment this afternoon, so I'll have to leave about 2, but I want to spend lunch looking at the harvest policy and seeing where we can do what Chris had suggested earlier, which is really include these phrases that we use a lot in our presentations, and make sure that they are referred to, if not used, in the policy itself. So I wanted to take a little bit of time and do that. I might give you my results in the chat if it's past time, but
Okay.
I'm going to do that. So really good discussion today. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 paths forward for edits. You know, for minor edits, you could probably just email me or the secretariat and make suggestions there.
Right.
Or we can put them into the MSAB report. But if it's something like, you know, oh, use this word instead of that word, you know, you might just send that to me and as a suggestion as an MSAB member.
That's perfect. Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, don't feel like this is your only chance to have a say in this. You know, my door is always open.
Thank you.
All right. Do we want to break for lunch for how long? And I think how many people will not be here this afternoon? If you want to just raise your hand, I think there's some that have to leave at 1:30. Peggy said she has to leave at 2. Is there anybody who's not going to be here 2 o'clock or later? Peggy, Forrest. Okay, we have some. Yeah. Oh, good. All right. Well, how long would people like lunch? And then we'll come back to a drafting session, and then we'll take a short break for the secretariat to just clean up the report, and then we'll walk through it for adoption. Would 45 minutes be too short, or people want an hour? I know that there might be a little bit of people might be working over the lunch as well.
I'm okay with 45 minutes.
All right, we got 45 minutes. Seems like a lot of people are in support of that. A few more people typing. What do you think, Gwen and Pete? 45 minutes, does that work? Or maybe 50 minutes? Come back at 1:15?
1:15 is a nice number.
Yep.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Excellent work, everybody. Thank you very much for your patience and contributions. All right, we'll see everybody at 1:15, and we'll dive back into the report. What I'll do is I'll clean up this version we were working on this morning. I'll email it out to all the MSAB members immediately, so you just have that in the new paragraphs. So expect an email shortly if you want to take a look at it. See you soon.
Thanks, folks. Thanks, Alan.